In this video, we're going to be discussing the evolution of Western philosophical thinking. And to do that, we're going to have to start with talking about how in ancient Greek thinking, they began to think of nature in a different kind of way, significantly different kind of way than had been done before. Ancient Greek thinking evolved out of a pre-scientific science of nature. Pre-scientific now, remember, ancient, 6 centuries BC. There was no such thing as science as we know it today. You know, science rooted in math, based on math and uh, testing theories. None of that. That evolved way later in the modern period. Over 1,000, 1,600, no, close to 2,000 years later. So what they did was viewed nature as imbued with personality. The Greek pre-scientific age was unique in that it began to explain physical events of the world by describing other physical events that led up to that event. So let me explain what I mean here. Up to this point in ancient history, nature was imbued with personality, and this is the way it is in most ancient and primitive cultures. Nature is full of spirits and all kinds of unforeseen forces that have motives, like persons have motives. And that's all quite natural, you know, in the way that we speak of Mother Nature as depicted here, you know, causing things. Well, we mean that in a cute way. They meant it literally. They didn't refer to Mother Nature so much as all kinds of different gods that were causing the events of the physical world to happen. And it's only natural that they would interpret things that way. I mean, after all, what could cause an earthquake other than something bigger than the earthquake? Well, that's got to be some sort of god of some kind, some unfathomable, huge force out there. And so everything that happens, whether it's the good rain that causes your crops to grow or the bad rain in a hurricane that destroys your crops, or the fire that cooks your food, or the fire that comes from lightning that burns forests, it's all viewed as having been caused by some huge and powerful entity that is trying to bless or curse or otherwise intend to do this sort of thing. Well, the unique thing is that happened in Greece in ancient times was that their religion was sort of evolving in a way that said, you know, the gods aren't very interested in us. Zeus keeps telling all the gods to stay away from us. We're bad news. And it doesn't seem like they're very involved because the good aren't blessed any more than anybody else, and they're not immune to pain and suffering more than anyone else. So, what if, just what if, the gods weren't behind all these events in nature? How would we interpret them? How would we explain them if we didn't use the gods? Not that the gods didn't exist, but that they just weren't involved. And so they began to speculate. How would we explain the rising of the tide or lightning or, or the like if you couldn't attribute it to a god? So they took the personality out of nature, and this made a phenomenal difference in thinking. It was the Ionian Greeks that first did that. They were the first to depersonalize nature, and it created an enormous explosion of thinking, as you can see in this guy's head right here, you know, especially among what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers that followed. Being able to speculate about the causes of events in nature if nature was a depersonalized force that didn't mean anything by it, but just was mechanically happening, that idea just liberated their thinking. And it resulted in a kind of metaphysical speculation amongst philosophers. And these are what we call the Pre-Socratic philosophers, a handful of them. And they are um, guys that were just sitting around and saying, all right, so we don't attribute it to the gods. Well, then what is the world, and how does it work? And they began to ask the questions, what is everything made up of? It's just a quite natural progression of thought. And Thales posited that it was all made of water, and Anaximenes said air, and Heraclitus fire, meaning energy, and so forth, until we get to the atomists, or like Democritus, that said everything is atoms. Well, Democritus means by the word atom, atom, a thing. Imagine that you are sitting here thinking about this in a pre-scientific age. You don't have electron microscopes, etc. You just have to lie in your bed at night in the dark and think. You can't look at anything. You're just thinking, and he speculates, well, you know, if you cut something in half, say you have this tiny pebble, and you cut it in half, and cut it in half again, and continue to cut it in half, well, what's going to happen? Do you get down to something that's so small that it can't be cut in half again? And Democritus wants to say, well, yeah, you have to get down to something that is eventually indestructible, so it can't go out of existence. It's imperceptible because it's so small, you could never see it, and that it's unchanging. It's static in that sense. It just is what it is, never changes, and therefore it's eternal. Well, this is pretty much our view of the atomic subatomic world as we perceive it. Okay, well, this was sort of a materialistic metaphysics that began to evolve. They were very concerned with looking out at their world and understanding the world all about them metaphysically. All of reality, according to Democritus, is composed only of matter or atoms and the void, meaning space for the atoms to move about in. And this happened, 6 centuries BC. Not bad. Well, Socrates listens to all this, and he was dissatisfied with this, what we referred to as a materialistic drift that only answered how and not why. He says, okay, so you figure out that the world, each event is being caused by some other event just according to the laws of nature. Well, that doesn't tell me anything about why things are that way. It doesn't inform me in any way as to how I should live in order to be happy or fulfilled. It doesn't tell me anything about meaning. It doesn't tell me much as far as Socrates was concerned. He wanted to know why things are the way they are. He wanted to know how it affects living. That's why Socrates is more interested in ethics than anything. So up to this point, up until Socrates, the eyes of philosophy had been turned outward on nature, trying to understand the external world. Socrates now wants to turn our eyes inward, and he spawned in this way a new way to speculate about reality and knowledge, thinking in terms of what is important, what is to be valued, and what do we mean by these words that we're even using to describe the world outside of us. So, rather than looking for beginnings and causes, like all the pre-Socratics were doing, this causes that, how did things get started? Notice, how? How is the question. Socrates instead looked for endings, purpose, meaning, where everything, what is the trajectory of all these things? Why do they go where they go? And how does that inform us about why things are the way they are? Is there any purpose or meaning to the life that we're experiencing?